These are the notes for 2.6. As always, put the date that you're taking them right here. If you don't know it, look it up. And our question today is just going to be, it's a nice, easy, short lesson today. And it's going to be, how do I use what we call the quotes zero product property. Now, the fact that you know that it's called the zero product property is worthless, but you need to know what it states. And so loosely, I'm going to show you what it means. And I'm going to have you try to keep up with me here. I want you to put the number 2 in your head. And then I'd like you to multiply it by 3. And then I'd like you to multiply that by 6. And then I'd like you to multiply that by 10. And then I'd like you to multiply by pi, and then by 1/9, and then by 0.14, and then by 0, and then by 18. What's the answer? And I'm sure you kept up with me about till here, and then you just said, screw it, I can't keep up, I don't know pi, I don't know how to take a 9th. But the minute I said this, you should have been back on board, because this whole thing has to equal 0. And basically what you're using is what we call the zero product property. And what it states is that if stuff multiplies to equal 0, then at least one factor or piece of the multiplication problem must have been 0. So what it says loosely is this. If, and we'll just take 2 things, but I could have a million things. If 2 things multiply to equal a 0, then what we know is that either A has to equal 0 or B has to equal 0. If not, there's no way you're getting 0 out. So how do we use this to solve things? Well, if they're already factored, which they're going to be today, it's nice and easy. Because if 2 things multiply to equal 0, then what we know is, and here's my multiplication right here. It's kind of like a little invisible fence here for multiplication. What I know is if these 2 factors multiply to equal 0, then one or the other has to be 0. So what I know is either x plus 4 has to equal 0. If it's not, then x minus 5 has to equal 0. So when we solve this for x, all we need to do is the opposite. So on this one, we subtract 4, and we'd say x is equal to -4, which makes sense because if x is -4, when I add 4, I get 0, and then it doesn't even matter what I say after that. The minute you say 0 times, doesn't matter. Your answer is going to be 0. On this side, the opposite of subtraction is addition. So the other solution would be x equals 5. So we get 2 solutions. We set each factor equal to 0. Now that one was easy, and because you guys had this last semester, you might say, I just know that. I just look and do the opposite. So what I'm going to do is focus more on the kinds that people struggled with first semester. So let's call this example 1. And you might have to go to the back of your sheet or whatever. But let's suppose it's 2x minus 1 times 3x plus 5. That gives you a 0. These 2 factors are a little uglier than the last 2, but it doesn't matter. I still do it the same way. If this times this gives you a 0, then what I know is that either the left side is equal to 0, so I'm going to set it equal, or the right side is equal to 0. And now what I need to do is solve this for x. Well, all I do is the opposite operations. To get rid of a -1, I add 1 to both sides. That gives me 2x is equal to 1. To undo multiplying by 2, I divide both sides by 2, and I get x is equal to 1/2. Now let's go see if that works. I'm going to travel up here and put a half in for x. 2 times a half, or a half of 2 is 1, minus 1 is 0. So that makes this factor 0. So it doesn't even matter what else I'm multiplying by. The minute you say 0 in a multiplication problem, the answer is 0. Well, if this piece isn't 0 and the answer is 0, then what it means is that other factor has to be 0. So we'll just do the opposite over here, the inverse operations. The opposite of adding is to subtract. The opposite of multiplying by 3 is to divide by 3. And I get another solution. So these are the two solutions I get by using what we call the zero product property. Well, it seems kind of easy, and it is. The problem comes when it's not factored, and that's going to be the next set of notes. So I'm just going to do one more here. We got a nice short set of notes. So for this one, I'm going to go example 2. I'm going to put an x, a 3x minus 1, and an x plus 5, and tell you that these three things multiply to equal 0. Well, what do you know? You know that one of them has to be 0, and there's three things I'm multiplying. So either x is 0, or 3x minus 1 is 0, or x plus 5 is 0. So I just solved those three pieces. Well, what makes x 0 would just be 0. So x equals 0 is one solution. Next step, what makes 3x minus 1 equal to 0? Well, you solve it. You do the opposite. You add 1, and then you divide by 3. So 1/3 is another solution. What makes this last factor equal to 0? And you might say, I can see it, it's -5. Well, then go ahead and write it down. But really what you do is you do the opposite operation, and you subtract 5. So we'd get x is -5. So notice for this one, I got 3 answers. Not because there were 3 factors actually, but because there were 3 x's in this problem. So watch another one and be careful. If instead of an x, I'd had a 5 out front, and then maybe a 2x plus 7 and an x minus 9. I'm going to let you write that down. I wrote that really fast, so I'll give you a minute to write that down. This is a 7 right here. So notice on this one, I only see x in this problem twice. So what that means is I'm going to get 2 answers. In this one up above here, I had x in all 3 factors. But if 3 things multiply to equal 0, it means one of them has to be 0. Well, 5 can't be 0. So that's not contributing an answer. Up on this one, though, x could have been 0, and it would have wiped it out before I even started. Watch. If x had been 0, I would have had 0 times 3 times 0 minus 1 times 0 plus 5. And I do get a 0 out. But for this one, that's a 5. It's not an x. So that's not going to contribute any kind of an answer. All right? That's supposed to be a check mark, but whatever. The only thing that can happen here is that 2x plus 7 could equal 0. Or x minus 9 could equal 0. But there's no planet in the universe where 5 can equal 0. That's redonkulous, and so don't write it down. So I'm going to do the opposite operation, and I'm going to get 2x is equal to -7. To undo multiplication, I divide by 2, and I'll get x is equal to -7 halves. That's one solution. My other solution is the opposite of -9 is adding 9, and I can easily see that 9 minus 9 is 0, so that one doesn't really require work. And I have 2 solutions. So in summary, to use the zero product property, you just set each factor equal to 0 and solve for x, or the variable. That's it. It's nice and easy. So your next worksheet will be worksheet number 6, and it's purple. There's only 10 problems. It's a nice short one that shouldn't take you very long. But the next one is worksheet number 6, and it is bright purple. Over and out. Peace out, Girl Scout.